In the spring of 1945, when American troops kicked open the gates of the Dachau concentration camp, they witnessed a scene straight out of hell. Amidst the piles of corpses and the overpowering stench of death lay a man weighing less than 36 kilograms, a living skeleton, ravaged by starvation and typhus, waiting for the end in a special bunker reserved for the Nazis' most loathed enemies. Yet just 7 years earlier, this same man had stood at the absolute summit of European aristocracy. He was not a criminal nor a reckless mercenary. He was Prince Xavier of Bourbon-Parma, the brother of the last Empress of Austria, a man who dined with kings and lived in gilded palaces. How does a prince of the blood end up rotting in a Nazi death camp? Why did a man who could have easily waited out the war in the luxurious safety of neutral Switzerland choose to dive headfirst into the French resistance? This is not a fairy tale. This is the brutal, untold true story of an aristocrat who looked the devil in the eye and refused to kneel. Xavier was born on May 25, 1889, at the Villa Pianori near Viareggio, Italy. His father was Robert I, Duke of Parma. However, there is a crucial detail that dictated the fate of the entire clan. Robert was a deposed duke. The word deposed was the key that defined Xavier's entire existence. He grew up in a family that possessed every privilege of royalty, titles, immense wealth, dozens of castles scattered across Europe, and the absolute reverence of the faithful, except for one thing: actual political power. They were royalty in exile, a government in waiting. They lived in a state of suspension, forever believing that the modern world was just a passing phase, a temporary madness, and that eventually Europe would come to its senses and invite them back to the throne. It was a strange, cloistered existence, divorced from the reality of the industrial age dawning outside their castle walls. Xavier's father, Duke Robert, was a man of prodigious fertility. He married twice and fathered a staggering 24 children. The resulting brood was less a family and more a small army of princes and princesses, a stud farm for European royalty. Xavier's siblings would go on to marry into almost every remaining ruling house on the continent, creating a dense web of alliances that spanned from Madrid to Vienna, from Brussels to Rome. The most famous product of this royal nursery was Xavier's younger sister, Zita. When Zita married Archduke Karl, the heir to the Habsburg throne, in 1911, the Bourbon-Parmas were suddenly thrust back from the sidelines to the absolute center of world power. In 1916, in the middle of the carnage of World War I, Karl and Zita were crowned Emperor and Empress of Austria-Hungary. For a brief, shimmering moment, Xavier's sister was the first lady of an empire of 50 million people. But young Xavier was never particularly seduced by the glitter of the imperial court in Vienna. While he understood his duty to his lineage, his personal character was being forged in a much hotter, more intense fire than the airy salons of the Hofburg Palace. His parents were not just Catholic. They were intensely, almost fanatically devout. Their worldview was shaped by a rigid, uncompromising traditionalism that saw the church as the ultimate authority against the chaos of liberalism and modernity. They believed that duty to God and duty to their dynastic position were one and the same. To mold their sons into men capable of carrying this heavy burden, they looked for an education that would strip away softness and instill an iron will. In 1899, they sent 10-year-old Xavier and his brother Sixtus away from the sun-drenched comforts of Italy to the austere mountains of Austria, to a legendary Jesuit college called Stella Matutina in the town of Feldkirch. You must forget any modern concepts of a private boarding school. There were no cozy common rooms or indulgent masters here. Stella Matutina was famous, even feared, throughout Catholic Europe for its severity. It was less a school and more a spiritual and physical penal colony for the sons of the aristocracy. The Jesuits who ran it believed that the human will was something that needed to be broken before it could be properly rebuilt in God's image. The discipline was military in its precision and unforgiving in its nature. The boys rose in the freezing darkness of the alpine pre-dawn for hours of prayer before a full day of rigorous academic study in Latin, Greek, and philosophy. The food was sparse, plain, and intentionally unappealing, designed merely to sustain the body, not to provide pleasure. Heating was considered a luxury that bred weakness. The slightest infraction of the labyrinthine rules, a whispered word during silent hours, a poorly made bed, a moment of inattention in chapel, was met with swift, humiliating, and physical punishment. For a boy used to the warmth of Italy and the indulgences of castle life, it was a shock to the system that would have crushed a weaker spirit. Yet Xavier didn't just endure Stella Matutina. He absorbed it. He learned to detach his mind from physical discomfort. He learned that hunger, cold, and exhaustion were just sensations that could be mastered by willpower. He internalized a brand of Catholicism that was muscular, sacrificial, and deeply serious. Decades later, when Xavier was rotting in a Nazi bunker, starving, freezing, and covered in his own filth, a fellow prisoner, on the verge of total collapse, asked him in a trembling whisper how a soft prince could possibly keep going in such conditions. Xavier managed a weak, cracked smile, his eyes bright in his gaunt face, and whispered back, "Oh, my friend, this is nothing. I already survived Stella Matutina." That brutal Jesuit education, intended to create a soldier for Christ, inadvertently created the perfect psychological armor for surviving the concentration camps. It taught him two things that would eventually save his life when everything else was stripped away: how to endure immense pain without complaint, and an absolute, unshakable religious faith that existed entirely independent of his external circumstances. Xavier graduated from this crucible and went on to study agronomy and law in Paris, further honing an intellect that was already sharp. But the world outside was darkening. The delicate balance of power that his family had navigated for centuries was unraveling. When World War I exploded across Europe in 1914, the Bourbon-Parma family, like the continent itself, tore itself apart. It was a tragic absurdity of the royal system. Xavier's brothers living in Austria, subjects of their brother-in-law, the emperor, were legally obligated to put on uniforms and fight for the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary. But Xavier felt differently. Though his lineage was ancient and European, his heart identified deeply with France, the ancestral homeland that had exiled his family. More importantly, he possessed a deep-seated instinctive revulsion toward the Prussian militarism that was driving the German war machine. He saw in it a mechanical, dehumanizing force that was antithetical to his Catholic values. Despite France banning princes of former ruling houses from serving in its military, Xavier was determined to fight for the Allied cause. He and his brother Sixtus traveled north and enlisted in the Belgian army. Xavier didn't use his title to secure a comfortable staff job miles behind the lines, pushing papers and looking at maps in a clean chateau. He wanted no special treatment. He enlisted as a private. He was sent into the meat grinder of the Western Front, into the mud and blood of Flanders. He experienced the full horrors of industrialized warfare up close. He lived in rat-infested trenches, standing knee-deep in freezing water, surrounded by the stench of unburied bodies. He went over the top into the face of machine gun fire that cut men down like wheat. He saw friends, commoners he had come to love as brothers, turned into pink mist by artillery shells made in German factories. The war was a revelation. It stripped away any lingering romantic notions he might have had about martial glory. He saw the immense, pointless suffering inflicted by authoritarian regimes, convinced of their own righteousness. He saw how quickly civilization could degenerate into barbarism. By the end of the war in 1918, Xavier had risen from private to captain. He had been decorated for bravery under fire with the French Croix de Guerre and the Belgian Order of Leopold. The empires of old, including the one his sister Zita had briefly ruled, had crumbled into dust. The map of Europe was redrawn, but Prince Xavier emerged from the trenches with something far more valuable than a crown, a hardened resolve and a fully formed moral compass. He had seen the face of modern tyranny in the trenches, and he had learned that it must be fought, not with diplomatic notes, but with total commitment. As the 1920s roared and then faded into the grim, darkening 1930s, Xavier, now a seasoned veteran with a steel core beneath his aristocratic exterior, looked east toward Germany and south toward Italy. He saw the same monstrous ideologies that had shattered Europe rising again, louder, angrier, and more organized than before. He knew with a chilling certainty that his war was not over. It was just beginning. With the guns of the Great War finally silent, Europe exhaled. The trenches were filled in. The barbed wire rolled up, and a traumatized continent tried desperately to remember what normal life felt like. For Xavier, the transition from the mud-soaked horror of Flanders to civilian life was jarring. He was 30 years old, a decorated captain with a chest full of medals and a mind full of ghosts. The world he had known before 1914, the world of undisputed imperial grandeur, was dead, buried in the rubble of the Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires. He was a prince without a throne, a soldier without a war, and a man searching for a purpose in a fractured new century. He found his sanctuary in the heart of France. Despite his family's Italian roots and cosmopolitan reach, Xavier's soul had always tilted toward the French countryside. In the early 1920s, seeking to root himself in the soil he had fought to defend, he purchased the Château de Bost. Situated in the Besson commune in the Allier department of central France, Bost was not a cold, imposing fortress meant for projecting power. It was a home, a beautiful, sprawling manor house dating back to the 15th century, surrounded by ancient trees, rolling vineyards, and fertile farmland. Here, Xavier meticulously constructed a life that looked, from the outside, like a pastoral idyll. He shed the uniform and donned the tweed of the gentleman farmer. He threw himself into the rhythms of agriculture with the same intense discipline he had applied to his Jesuit studies. He didn't just own the land, he managed it. He studied crop rotations, worried about the price of wheat, and walked the rows of his vineyards, checking the grapes for rot. He became a fixture in the local community, not as a distant, haughty lord, but as a pious, serious neighbor who attended Mass every Sunday and engaged the local farmers in long discussions about soil quality and livestock. In 1927, he cemented this new life by marrying Madeleine de Bourbon-Busset. It was a match that thrilled the genealogists. Madeleine belonged to a cadet branch of the Bourbon family that had stayed in France for centuries. She was a woman of striking character, sharing Xavier's devout Catholicism and his steely resolve. Together, they filled the halls of Boss with the noise of children. Françoise, Charles Hugues, Marie-Thérèse, Cécile, Marie de Neige, and Sixtus Henri arrived in steady succession. For a decade, the Château de Bosts was an island of domestic bliss. One could imagine Xavier in his library, surrounded by centuries of history, believing that perhaps the storm had passed him by, that he could live out his days as a patriarch, tending his garden while the world healed. But Xavier was not merely a farmer. Beneath the surface of this rustic tranquility, he remained a potent political figure, and the threads of his ancestry were pulling him into a conflict that would prove fatal. To understand the specific suffocating danger Xavier would soon face, one must look south across the Pyrenees to Spain. The Bourbon-Parma family was the standard-bearer for a movement known as Carlism. This was a complex, fiercely traditionalist Spanish political faction that rejected the liberal monarchy and later the Spanish Republic. They believed in God, fatherland, and king, and they held that Xavier's uncle, Alfonso Carlos, was the legitimate king of Spain. When Alfonso Carlos died childless in 1936, the Carlist succession became a crisis. In his will, he named Xavier, his nephew, as the regent of the Carlist communion. Suddenly, the gentleman farmer of Bos was the acting head of a massive militant political movement in a country on the brink of civil war. This title was a poisoned chalice. When the Spanish Civil War erupted in 1936, the Carlists initially sided with the nationalist uprising led by General Francisco Franco, believing they were fighting a holy crusade against communism. Xavier traveled into Spain, visiting the front lines, acting as a royal figurehead for the red-berated Carlist militias, the Requete. But Xavier quickly realized that Francisco Franco was not a restorer of tradition. He was a modern totalitarian dictator in the making. Franco wanted absolute power, centralized and fascist in nature. Xavier, with his deep-seated suspicion of authoritarianism born in the trenches of WWI, refused to bend the knee. He openly criticized Franco's methods and his ambition. He refused to let the Carlist movement be swallowed whole by Franco's Falange Party. The friction between the prince and the dictator turned toxic. Franco, a man who never forgot a slight, expelled Xavier from Spain. The Generalissimo marked the Prince of Bourbon-Parma down in his black book, not just as a nuisance, but as an enemy of the state. This distinction is crucial. Years later, when the Nazis would ask for diplomatic cover to murder Xavier, they would look to Spain, and Franco would shrug. The prince's political integrity in 1937 signed his death warrant in 1944. While Xavier battled Franco's fascists in the south, a darker, far more dangerous shadow was lengthening from the east. The rise of Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich viewed the old European aristocracy with deep suspicion. To the Nazis, men like Xavier were internationalists, Catholics, and potential rivals, relics of an old order that needed to be swept away to make room for the new order of the Aryan master race. Then came the spring of 1940. The phony war ended, and the German blitzkrieg smashed into France with the force of a sledgehammer. The French army, considered the finest in Europe, collapsed in just 6 weeks. The roads of France became rivers of despair as millions of refugees fled south, clutching their possessions in suitcases and wheelbarrows, desperate to outrun the panzers. Xavier watched the collapse from the windows of Bos. The armistice signed in June 1940 tore France in two. The northern half and the Atlantic coast were under direct German military occupation. The south was left under the nominal control of the collaborationist Vichy regime, led by the aging World War I hero, Marshal Philippe Pétain. Fate, it seemed, had a cruel sense of geography. The Château de Bos was located in the Allier department, squarely in the Vichy zone, but agonizingly close to the demarcation line, the heavily guarded border that separated Free France from the Nazi zone. The swastika flag was now flying over town halls just a few miles from Xavier's doorstep. German patrols were a common sight on the roads he used to cycle. At 51 years old, with a wife and 6 young children to protect, the logical, pragmatic choice would have been total invisibility. Xavier could have retreated behind the high walls of his estate, played the role of the pious aristocrat, and waited it out. He had friends in high places. He could have leveraged his royal connections to secure a safe passage to neutral Switzerland or Portugal. But the safe choice was physically repulsive to him. The man who had survived Stella Matutina and the Flanders mud could not sit idly by while his adopted country was strangled. His resistance did not begin with guns and bombs. It began with the simple, dangerous act of hospitality. As the Vichy regime tightened its grip, attempting to mold France into a fascist client state, they instituted the Service du Travail Obligatoire, STO. This law required young Frenchmen to be deported to Germany to work as slave labor in Nazi munitions factories. It was a blood tax, forcing French sons to build the bombs that would kill their allies. Thousands of young men refused. They fled their homes, taking to the forests and the mountains, becoming réfractaires, the seeds of the Maquis resistance. But they needed food, they needed shelter, and they needed papers. The Château de Boss transformed. By day it was a working farm. By night it was a sanctuary. Xavier opened his barns and outbuildings to these terrified young men. He used his own funds that were rapidly dwindling, to feed them. He didn't just hide peasants, he hid Jews fleeing the roundups in the north and Allied airmen who had been shot down and were being funneled down the secret rat lines towards Spain. The risk was astronomical. If a German patrol or the dreaded milice, the French paramilitary collaborators, who were often more brutal than the Gestapo, had found a British pilot or a Jewish family in the prince's cellar, the execution squad would have been waiting in the courtyard within the hour. Yet Xavier personally oversaw the operations. He turned his magnificent library, lined with leather-bound volumes of history and theology, into a clandestine infirmary. There, beneath the gaze of his ancestors' portraits, wounded resistance fighters were stitched up by local doctors, sworn to secrecy. For 4 years, Xavier lived a double life that would have shattered the nerves of a lesser man. In the morning, he was the prince, receiving local dignitaries and managing the harvest. In the evening, he was a conspirator, huddled over maps, coordinating supply drops and forging documents. As the war turned against Germany in 1944, the atmosphere in France shifted from oppression to terror. The resistance grew bolder, and the Nazi reprisals grew more savage. Xavier decided he could no longer stay on the periphery of the fight. He formally joined the resistance, not as a financier, but as a combatant. He linked up with the Special Operations Executive, SOE Networks, and the local Maquis group known as the Casa Nova Network. Despite his age, he was now 55, with graying hair and the stiff gait of a man who had known war before. He camped in the forests of the Auvergne with men young enough to be his sons. He slept on the ground, ate the same meager rations, and plotted ambushes against German convoys. It was during this feverish summer of 1944 that an event occurred which transformed Xavier from a shadow operator into a public enemy. It is a story that sounds like fiction, a moment of reckless, aristocratic bravado that belongs in a movie, yet it is documented historical fact. A group of young resistance fighters under Xavier's protection had been captured by the milice. They were dragged to the police headquarters in Vichy, the capital of the collaborationist state. The standard procedure for captured terrorists was brutal interrogation followed by a summary execution in a ditch. News of the arrest reached Boss. The prince knew there was no time to organize a jailbreak. The boys would be dead by sunset. Xavier put on his best suit. He walked out of his chateau, not to a car, but to his bicycle. He mounted it and began to pedal. He rode for miles, his lungs burning, past German checkpoints and milice patrols, straight into the heart of the lion's den, Vichy. He rode right up to the heavy doors of the Hôtel du Parc, the seat of Marshal Pétain's government. He dismounted and walked toward the guards. He was covered in dust, but he carried himself with an authority that no uniform could confer. When demanded to identify himself, he didn't whisper. He announced with the full imperious weight of 10 centuries of ruling history that the Prince of Bourbon-Parma demanded an audience with the Marshal. It was a gamble of insane proportions. He was a known anti-fascist, walking unarmed into the headquarters of a fascist regime. But the sheer audacity of it, the spectacle of a Bourbon prince demanding to see the head of state, paralyzed the bureaucracy. He was ushered in, face to face with Pétain, the ancient hero of Verdun, who had sold his soul to Hitler. Xavier did not beg. He demanded. He invoked the honor of France, the shame of the occupation, and the sacred duty to protect French youth. He essentially dared Pétain to murder the protégé of a Bourbon. Pétain, old, vacillating, and perhaps momentarily shamed by the presence of a man who represented the true history of France, crumbled. He signed the order. The men were released. Xavier walked out of the hotel, retrieved his bicycle, and rode back to Boss. He had won. He had saved the lives of his men. But as he pedaled through the twilight, Xavier must have known that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. He had humiliated the regime in its own capital. He had revealed himself not just as a sympathizer, but as an active, fearless opponent who could walk through walls. The Gestapo chief in Vichy, a man named Hugo Geisler, was furious. The troublesome prince had been tolerated for too long because of his high connections and the fear of a diplomatic incident. But the war was entering its desperate phase. The gloves were off. There was no more room for diplomacy, no more immunity for princes. At the Château de Bosts, the summer air was thick with the scent of lavender and impending doom. Xavier sent his older children away to safety, but he refused to leave his home. He waited. 3 weeks later, the sound of heavy engines shattered the morning silence. The morning of July 22nd, 1944, at the Château de Bosts, began with the deceptive calm of a French summer. The vineyards were lush, the sun was climbing over the Allier countryside, and the war, though raging just over the horizon, felt momentarily distant. Xavier was sitting down to lunch with his wife Madeleine. It was a domestic scene that had played out in his family for centuries, the quiet, orderly ritual of a meal in a house built to endure generations. But the silence was shattered not by bombs, but by the grinding gears of engines. The sound was distinct and terrified every French citizen who heard it. The heavy mechanical roar of traction engine trucks and sleek black Citroëns. They came tearing up the gravel driveway, scattering the chickens and breaking the peace of the estate forever. The Gestapo had arrived. These were not the polite Wehrmacht officers of the early occupation who might have clicked their heels and saluted a prince. These were the men of Hugo Geisler, the ruthless SS commander of the region. They swarmed out of the vehicles, submachine guns raised, shouting orders in barking, guttural German. They didn't knock. They kicked the doors in. For Xavier, the moment he had been expecting for 4 years had finally arrived. He didn't run. He didn't try to flee out the back entrance or hide in the priest hole where he had sheltered so many others. He stood up from the table, wiped his mouth, and walked into the hallway to meet them. The search that followed was a violation. The soldiers tore through the chateau with calculated violence. They ripped tapestries from the walls, overturned antique furniture, and dumped the contents of drawers onto the floor. They were looking for the terrorist network. They found enough maps, forged papers, and evidence of the financial support Xavier had funneled to the Maquis. The commanding officer didn't address him as Your Highness. To them, he was simply a traitor to his class and an enemy of the Reich. They grabbed him roughly. There was no time for a long, tearful farewell. Xavier was allowed a brief moment with Madeleine. He looked at her with the steady, calm eyes that had seen the trenches of Flanders, and whispered a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. I will return. As he was shoved into the back of a black car flanked by armed guards, Xavier looked back at the Château de Bosse. The grand stone house, which had been his sanctuary and his fortress, disappeared behind a cloud of dust. He would not see it again for a very long time, and the man who would eventually return would be a shadow of the one leaving now. He was taken first to the Gestapo headquarters in Vichy, the Hotel of Portugal, a place whose basement was stained with the blood of the resistance. But Xavier was a high-value catch. He was quickly transferred to the military prison in Clermont-Ferrand, specifically the bleak fortress of the 92nd Infantry Regiment. The interrogation began almost immediately. The Nazis were confused by him. They were used to dealing with communists, socialists, and angry students. They didn't know what to make of a Bourbon prince who spoke perfect German, thanks to his Austrian schooling, and looked at them not with fear, but with a palpable sense of disdain. They wanted names. They knew he was the linchpin connecting the aristocratic funding to the rural fighters. They demanded the locations of the drop zones and the identities of the other Casanova network leaders. Xavier sat in a wooden chair under the glare of a lamp, his face bruised from the softening up blows, and gave them nothing. He used his intellect as a shield. He engaged them in theological debates. He questioned their authority. He played the role of the confused elderly gentleman farmer, then switched to the sharp legal mind of a Sorbonne graduate. He frustrated them to the point of rage. After weeks of this cat-and-mouse game, the verdict came down. It was typed on a thin piece of paper stamped with the eagle and swastika. Prince Xavier of Bourbon-Parma was guilty of terrorism, espionage, and treason against the new order. The sentence was death. For the next month, Xavier lived in the shadow of the firing squad. Every morning at dawn, the heavy steel doors of the prison would clang open. Boots would echo in the corridor. A name would be barked out. Xavier would listen as a fellow prisoner was dragged from his cell, followed minutes later by the dry crackle of a volley of rifles from the courtyard. Every morning, he prayed the rosary, preparing his soul for the moment they would call Bourbon-Parma. But the call never came. History is still hazy on exactly why the order to execute him was paused. Some suggest that Marshal Pétain, terrified of the historical stain of allowing a Bourbon to be shot on French soil, burned his last ounces of political capital to beg for a commutation. Others believe the Nazis, ever pragmatic, thought a living prince might be a more valuable hostage than a dead martyr. But the alternative they chose was a fate designed to be worse than death. The death sentence was not lifted. It was merely suspended and replaced with a different stamp on his file: Nacht und Nebel, night and fog. This decree, issued by Hitler himself in 1941, was a masterpiece of psychological cruelty. It was designed specifically for political prisoners in occupied territories. The order stated that these prisoners were not to be executed immediately, nor were they to be given a trial. Instead, they were to be transported to Germany and vanish without a trace. Their families were to be told nothing. No letters were allowed in or out. If they died in the camps, no death certificate would be issued. They were to simply dissolve into the mist, leaving their loved ones in an eternal agonizing purgatory of not knowing. Before the transport began, the Gestapo made one final cynical attempt to wash their hands of the diplomatic awkwardness. They contacted the Spanish government. Xavier was, after all, the Carlist claimant to the Spanish throne. Technically, he was a Spanish royal. The German Foreign Office sent a cable to Madrid. They asked General Francisco Franco if his government had any objection to the deportation of Prince Xavier, or if they wished to claim him. It was Xavier's moment of truth. Franco's contempt for him, cultivated years earlier, now crystallized in a single bureaucratic sentence. The reply from Madrid was brief, cold, and devastating. Spain has no interest in this person. With that sentence, the last safety net was cut. Xavier was stripped of his diplomatic protection. He was no longer a royal highness. He was no longer a political figure. He was simply cargo. In late August 1944, as the Allied armies were sweeping across France, liberating towns and villages, Xavier was moving in the opposite direction. He was taken from his cell and marched to the rail yards. There, he saw the true face of the Nazi machine. A train of cattle cars waited on the tracks. These were wooden boxcars designed to hold 8 horses or 40 men. The SS guards, shouting and swinging rifle butts, forced 80, 90, sometimes 100 men into each car. Xavier was shoved into the crushing mass of humanity. The doors were slid shut and barred from the outside. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the slivers of light coming through the cracks in the wood. The heat was immediate and suffocating. The journey that followed was a descent into the primitive. There was no water. There was no food. There was one bucket for sanitation, which overflowed within hours. The stench of sweat, excrement, and fear became a physical weight. Men screamed in the darkness. Some went mad from claustrophobia. Old men died standing up, their bodies held upright by the crush of the living. Xavier, 55 years old and already weakened by prison, found himself pressed against the rough wood of the wall. He did not panic. In the suffocating darkness, a low, steady voice began to recite prayer. It was Xavier. He couldn't offer them water, but he could offer them dignity. He urged the men around him to remain calm, to breathe slowly, to hold on to their humanity for just one more hour, then one more. The train rattled east for days, stopping and starting, shunted onto sidings to let troop trains pass. They crossed the border into the Reich. The scenery outside the cracks changed from the rolling fields of France to the dark, pine-covered hills of the Vosges Mountains. Finally, the train stopped. The doors were thrown open and the fresh, cold air hit them like a hammer. They spilled out onto a gravel platform, gasping, blinking in the harsh light. They were in Alsace, in a place that looked like a postcard of alpine beauty, but smelled of death. High on a windswept plateau surrounded by dense forests stood a fortress of barbed wire and watchtowers. This was Nutzweiler Struthof. It was the only concentration camp built on what was historically French soil. Though the Nazis had annexed the region, it was a Category 3 camp, a classification reserved for protective custody. Prisoners considered heavily accusable and unlikely to be rehabilitated. It was a death camp, but not by gas. It was a camp of liquidation through labor. Xavier was marched through the gates. The shouting was constant. Schnell, schnell, faster, faster. He was driven into a processing hut. Here, the final dismantling of the prince began. He was ordered to strip. His suit, the last vestige of his former life, was thrown onto a pile. His wedding ring was torn from his finger. His head, which had worn the invisible weight of a crown, was shaved bald by a prisoner barber who didn't look him in the eye. He was thrown a uniform, the iconic blue and white striped pajamas made of rough, thin fabric that offered zero protection against the biting mountain wind. He pulled the scratchy cloth over his skin. Then came the baptism of ink. He was no longer Prince Xavier. He was no longer the Duke's son. He was a number. In the ledger of the camp, he was processed simply as a unit of labor, expected to survive perhaps 3 months on the calorie intake of a small child. He walked out of the processing hut and into the Appellplatz, the roll call square. He stood in rows of thousands of other shaven, striped ghosts. The wind whipped across the mountain, cutting through the thin uniform. He looked around. To his left were communists. To his right were resistance fighters. Behind him were Jews. Social class, titles, wealth, history. It all evaporated in the cold air of Natzweiler. The playing field had been leveled in the most horrific way possible. A capo, a prisoner guard, usually a violent criminal given authority over others, walked down the line, screaming at the new arrivals. He stopped in front of Xavier. He saw a man who, despite the shaved head and the rags, still stood with an unconscious, ingrained posture of command. The capo sneered and struck him across the face. Xavier's head snapped back. He tasted blood. He didn't raise a hand to defend himself. He slowly turned his head back, looking straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the distant tree line. The prince had entered hell, but Natzweiler was only the threshold. The true abyss lay farther east. Natzweiler Struthof was not merely a prison. It was a machine designed to consume human beings. Perched high in the Vosges Mountains, it was perpetually shrouded in a damp, freezing mist that seeped into the very marrow of the prisoners' bones. The camp had been built near a vein of pink granite, and the Nazis, with their obsession for monumental architecture, intended to extract every ounce of it to build the stadiums and victory arches of the future Third Reich. The fuel for this extraction was human muscle. For Xavier, the shock of arrival was absolute. He was 55 years old, a man of refined habits who had spent the last 20 years managing vineyards and reading theology. Now, he was thrust into a landscape of mud, wire, and brutality that defied comprehension. The days began before dawn with a shrill scream of whistles. The prisoners were roused from their lice-infested bunks, given a bowl of coffee, a vile, lukewarm brown water, and marched to the quarry. The work was medieval. Men were forced to carry massive blocks of granite up steep, muddy slopes on their backs. If a man stumbled, he was beaten. If he fell and couldn't rise, he was kicked until he stopped moving, or simply thrown into the ravine. The SS guards at Natzweiler were notoriously sadistic, often setting their dogs on prisoners for sport. Xavier was stripped of every vestige of his identity. To the guards, he was not a Bourbon prince. He was simply Stuck, a piece, a unit. Yet in this abyss of dehumanization, Xavier began to wage a new kind of war. It was not a war of bullets or sabotage, but a war of the spirit. He realized early on that the Nazis' true goal was not just to kill the body, but to break the soul, to reduce men to animals fighting over a crust of bread. Xavier refused to cooperate. He maintained a fastidious, almost insane level of personal discipline. Despite the freezing water, he washed himself every chance he got. He kept his ragged uniform as clean as possible. He stood straight at roll call, refusing to cower before the blows of the capos. He also became a quiet anchor for the men around him. In the barracks at night, amidst the groans of the dying and the stench of dysentery, Xavier would crawl from bunk to bunk. He spoke to the young resistance fighters who were terrified and losing their minds. He didn't speak of politics or war. He spoke of home, of the beauty of the French countryside, of God. He became a father figure in a place where fathers were usually the first to die. One survivor later recalled seeing the prince sharing his ration, a meager slice of sawdust-filled bread, with a younger prisoner who was on the verge of starvation. In the economy of the camp, that bread was life itself. Giving it away was an act of suicide. But for Xavier, keeping it at the cost of his humanity was the greater sin. But the war was moving fast. By September 1944, the rumble of Allied artillery could be heard echoing through the valleys of Alsace. The Americans were coming. The Nazis, terrified of their prisoners being liberated and testifying to the atrocities, ordered the evacuation of Natzweiler. Xavier was thrown back onto a train. This journey took him deeper into the dark heart of Germany. The destination was a name that had already become a whisper of dread across Europe: Dachau. If Natzweiler was a brutal outpost, Dachau was the metropolis of terror. Located near Munich, it was the model camp, the prototype for the entire system. When Xavier arrived, the camp was in a state of chaotic, malignant collapse. It was vastly overcrowded, filled with skeletal survivors, death-marched from camps in the east. Typhus was raging through the barracks like a wildfire. The crematoriums ran 24 hours a day, belching a thick, sweet-smelling smoke that hung low over the compound, but they still couldn't keep up with the bodies. Corpses were stacked like firewood against the brick walls of the barracks. Upon arrival, Xavier was registered as prisoner number 101057. By the time he reached Dachau, the damage was already irreversible. The camp did not break him, it merely completed what Natzweiler had begun. The number mattered less than the survival of his rapidly failing body. Because of his high status, a prominent prisoner, Xavier was placed in a special section of the camp. The Nazis, ever the pragmatists, realized that as the war turned against them, men like Xavier, along with former prime ministers, bishops, and generals, might be valuable bargaining chips. They were hostages to be traded for safety if the Reich fell. But this privileged status was a double-edged sword. It meant he wasn't immediately worked to death in the general quarry, but it placed him under the direct, sadistic scrutiny of the SS leadership. They hated him. To the fanatical Nazis, Xavier was the ultimate class enemy, an internationalist aristocrat, a devout Catholic, and a traitor to his Germanic blood. They devised special torments for him. Whenever Xavier showed a spark of defiance, a refusal to salute quickly enough, a look of contempt directed at an officer, he was dragged to the camp prison, known as the bunker. The bunker was a place of silence and slow death. Xavier was thrown into a solitary concrete cell. It was unheated, damp, and utterly dark. Here, the starvation diet was applied. For days, he would receive nothing but water, then a cup of watery soup, then nothing again. The physical toll was catastrophic. Xavier was a man in his mid-50s. His body began to consume itself. The fat reserves were gone in weeks. Then the muscle tissue began to dissolve. His skin became translucent, stretched tight over his bones. His gums bled from scurvy, his teeth loosening in his head. Dysentery racked his body with agonizing cramps, leaving him lying in his own filth on the freezing concrete floor. During one of these stints in the bunker, the frostbite set in. The temperature in the cell dropped below freezing. Xavier had no blanket, only his thin striped pajamas. His feet, once accustomed to handmade leather boots, turned black and swollen. The pain was excruciating, a constant throbbing agony that made sleep impossible. The discipline forged in his Jesuit youth resurfaced here, not as a dramatic transformation, but as a quiet instinct for survival that carried him through the worst days. Yet even in the bunker, the prince did not break. There is a haunting testimony from a British officer, Captain Hardy, who was imprisoned in a nearby cell. Hardy described seeing Xavier being dragged out into the corridor by SS guards for interrogation. The prince was so weak he couldn't walk. His legs were useless sticks. He looked, Hardy wrote, like a resurrected corpse, a collection of bones held together by willpower. But as the SS officer screamed at him, spitting in his face, Xavier slowly, painfully used the wall to pull himself upright. He straightened his spine. He lifted his chin. He looked the Nazi directly in the eyes with a gaze of such withering, aristocratic contempt that the guard momentarily faltered. Xavier said nothing. He didn't need to. In that moment, the man in the dirty rags was the master, and the man in the black uniform was the servant. By the spring of 1945, Dachau was a circle of hell. The Allies were closing in, but for the prisoners, this was the most dangerous time. The SS debated simply liquidating everyone, gunning down the 30,000 survivors to hide the evidence. Xavier was now in the infirmary, the Revier. In most camps, the infirmary was just a waiting room for the gas chamber. But in the chaos of the final days, it was simply a place where men were left to rot. Xavier lay on a straw mattress, drifting in and out of a typhus-induced fever. He weighed 36 kilograms, 79 pounds. His rib cage looked like the hull of a wrecked ship. His eyes were sunken so deep into his skull they looked like dark bruises. He was dying. The doctors, fellow prisoners doing their best with no medicine, gave him days to live. He had made his peace with God. He whispered the names of his wife and children, wondering if they were safe, wondering if they would ever know where he lay. Outside the barbed wire, the world was ending. The sound of American artillery grew louder, a rolling thunder that shook the ground. Inside the camp, the SS guards were burning documents, drinking heavily, and shooting prisoners at random in fits of panic. Then a strange thing happened. On April 24th, 1945, just days before the liberation, orders came from Berlin. Orders arrived to move the prominent prisoners immediately. The delusional Nazi command intended to drag these high-value hostages into the Tyrol mountains for a final, desperate negotiation. Xavier, barely conscious, was dragged from his bed. He was thrown onto a bus with other high-profile captives. The former Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg, the French Prime Minister Léon Blum, British commando leaders, and members of the anti-Hitler plot families. It was a surreal convoy of the walking dead. They were driven south away from the advancing Americans into the high Alps. The journey was a nightmare of hairpin turns and Allied air attacks. They arrived at a luxury hotel in South Tyrol, the Hotel Prager Wildsee, which had been requisitioned by the SS. The situation was tense. The SS guards, led by a fanatic named Commander Stiller, had orders to execute the prisoners, rather than let them fall into Allied hands. Xavier lay in a hotel room, looking out at the majestic snow-capped mountains, the same mountains he had known in his youth. It was a cruel irony to die in such a beautiful place, so close to freedom. The prisoners knew they were living on borrowed time. The SS men were drinking in the lobby, hands hovering over their holsters, debating when to start the massacre. But the Wehrmacht, the regular German army, had also arrived in the village. These soldiers knew the war was lost. They wanted to surrender to the Americans with clean hands, not as accomplices to a mass murder of dignitaries. A standoff ensued. For hours, the regular army soldiers pointed their guns at the SS guards. It was a civil war within a world war, fought in the lobby of a mountain hotel. The Wehrmacht commander, Captain Wichard von Alvensleben, eventually forced the SS to back down. The fanatics fled into the mountains. Xavier was safe from the executioners, but he was not safe from his own body. He was hovering on the threshold of death. He was free technically, but he was trapped in a shattered physical shell. On May 4th, 1945, the first American jeep drove up the winding road to the hotel. The GIs, chewing gum and holding M1 Garands, walked into the hotel lobby. They found a collection of Europe's former elite, looking like ghosts. When the Americans found Xavier, they couldn't believe he was still breathing. They saw a man who had been reduced to the elemental components of life. They treated him with a gentleness that moved him to tears. They gave him chocolate, which his stomach couldn't handle, and cigarettes, which made him dizzy. But the war was over. The 1,000-year Reich had fallen, and the Prince of Bourbon-Parma, against every odd, against every law of probability, was still alive. But freedom did not mean immediate recovery. The battle for survival had merely shifted from the trenches to the hospital bed. American military doctors viewed his ravaged form with horror. His body had cannibalized its own organs to survive. His heart fluttered like a trapped bird, and his digestive system had nearly ceased to function. While the world celebrated victory with parades, Xavier lay paralyzed by weakness, learning to walk again like a child, and wrestling with nightmares that still smelled of the night and fog. It took months of intensive care before he could return to France, not as a conquering general, but as a fragile survivor in the back of an ambulance. The reunion with his family was heartbreaking. His wife and children could barely recognize the skeletal, aged stranger before them as the vigorous father who had left. However, the France Xavier returned to had no place for a hero of royal blood. Under the pragmatism of the post-war government, a devout Catholic prince, a descendant of kings, became an inconvenient figure. There were no state dinners, no grand parades. Xavier did not complain. He quietly retreated to his beloved Chateau de Bostes, walking his vineyards with a cane and a permanent limp, seeking solace in his library and his faith. He lived out his remaining years not as a bitter exile, but as a patriarch who had seen the worst of humanity and chosen to keep his soul intact. When he passed away in 1977, he was not left in a foreign field. His body was brought back to the land he had fought for. He was laid to rest in France at the Abbey of Saint-Pierre-de-Solesmes, surrounded by the chant of Benedictine monks. The prince who had been dragged to the darkest corners of the Reich had finally come home. Looking back at this tragic and magnificent journey, Xavier of Bourbon-Parma tore up the old definition of nobility based on bloodlines and rewrote it through sacrifice. He proved that true aristocracy is not found in thrones or silk, but in the refusal to choose safety over conscience. The Nazis stripped him of his youth, his health, and his status, but they failed in their primary mission to reduce him to a meaningless number. In the fires of the concentration camp, Xavier proved he was something far greater than a prince. He was a man, in the truest sense of the word, and that alone is a legacy that outlasts any empire.